The night Kofi Asante saved the Hartwell Group's biggest merger in 15 years, Vivian Hartwell was so shocked she dropped her champagne flute. It shattered on the marble floor of the Fairmont's grand ballroom, and for a moment, nobody moved. Everybody was looking at Kofi. He stood at the podium in a suit he had pressed himself that morning in a one-bedroom apartment on the east side of Brampton, speaking flawless Mandarin to a room full of people who had spent the last 2 years calling him the help. But that part of the story comes later. Kofi Asante arrived in Toronto in October, and the city hit him like cold water. Not the bad kind, the kind that wakes you up, that makes you feel every nerve. He had a single suitcase, a contact name written on a folded piece of paper, and a degree from the University of Ghana that he hadn't told anyone about yet. He wasn't hiding it, he just hadn't been asked. The job at the Hartwell house came through a domestic staffing agency on Bloor Street. The listing said, household manager, live-in position, immediate start. The pay was fair by the agency's standards, less than fair by Kofi's actual qualifications. But he needed the time. He needed to get settled, get his papers sorted, get his feet under him. He told himself it would be temporary. Most things that lasted years start out temporary. Vivian Hartwell interviewed him in the front sitting room of a house in Forest Hill that was larger than any building Kofi had grown up near. She sat very straight. She wore a cream blouse and looked at him the way people look at furniture they're not entirely sure about. You understand, she said, without preamble, that this is a household that runs on a schedule. Yes, Mrs. Hartwell, my son and his wife entertain frequently. I am often in residence. I have particular standards for how the house is managed. I understand. She looked him over once more, that same appraising look. Then she said, you can start Monday. That was it. No questions about his background. No questions about what he'd studied or where he was from or what his life looked like before this room. She had already decided what he was. The Hartwell household had 3 permanent residents: Vivienne, her son Callum, and Callum's wife, Yuki Tanaka Hartwell. Kofi learned the geography of the family fast, not because anyone explained it to him, but because silence teaches things quickly when you pay attention. Vivienne ran the house the way she ran everything, by deciding who mattered and by how much. Callum, 41, handsome in the way of men who have never been told no, ran the family business, a mid-sized financial advisory firm that had grown considerably under his grandfather and was now in a delicate negotiation with a Shanghai-based investment group called Meridian Capital. The deal, if it closed, would be the largest in Hartwell Group's history. Callum talked about it constantly, loudly, in the kitchen, on the phone, in the dining room, as though Kofi were part of the wallpaper. And Yuki. Yuki Tanaka Hartwell was 37, quiet in a way that people in that house confused with shyness. She had grown up in Vancouver, the daughter of Japanese-Canadian parents who had run a small dry cleaning business in Kitsilano until she was 12, at which point her father's health had declined and things had gotten complicated. She had put herself through university, then articled at a Bay Street firm, then left law entirely when she met Callum at a charity gala and made what her mother diplomatically called an interesting choice. She spoke 4 languages. She had never mentioned this to Vivienne or Callum. She hadn't exactly decided to hide it. It was more that no one had ever asked. Kofi noticed her the way you notice the person in a room who is doing the same thing you are, watching. He would be clearing the breakfast things, and she would be sitting at the kitchen island with a coffee cup she'd stopped drinking from 20 minutes ago, and she would be listening to Vivienne say something dismissive, and her face would be entirely neutral, and Kofi would think. She heard every word, and she filed every word, and she will not say anything yet. He recognized the posture. He lived in it himself. The first time Vivienne spoke about Yuki in front of Kofi, she did it in Mandarin. They were having dinner, Vivienne, Callum, and a colleague of Callum's named Bernard Lau, who was part of the advisory team on the Meridian deal. Yuki was at the table. Kofi was serving. He moved quietly, as he always did, refilling water, clearing the appetizer plates, and somewhere around the main course, Vivienne leaned toward Bernard Benz and said, in Mandarin, with no change in her pleasant dinner party expression, "She looks like she belongs behind a cash register. I honestly don't know what my son was thinking." Bernard, to his credit, looked briefly uncomfortable. Then he said something non-committal and reached for his wine. Callum laughed. Not at the joke, but at something Bernard had said a moment before. He hadn't caught it. He didn't speak Mandarin either. Kofi set down the plate he was holding very carefully. He looked at Yuki. She was cutting her salmon. Her expression was pleasant and unbothered and entirely composed, the way a person's face is composed when they have trained themselves, very deliberately, not to react. She had heard. Kofi knew she had heard because he had heard it too. He had studied Mandarin for 3 years at the University of Ghana as part of a business program designed specifically for students who planned to work in international trade. He had tested at advanced conversational level. He had never mentioned this to the Hartwells, because as he had come to understand in the months he'd worked there, the Hartwells did not think of him as a person who had studied anything. He caught Yuki's eye across the table. Just for a moment. She gave nothing away. But she saw him notice. After dinner, when Kofi was in the kitchen and Yuki came to get a glass of water, she stood beside the sink and said quietly, in English, "The salmon was overcooked tonight. Not your fault. The oven temperature is uneven on the left side." "I'll adjust next time," Kofi said. A pause. "Bernard Lau," she said carefully, "is the Hartwell's primary liaison to the Meridian team." She didn't look at him when she said it. She just drank her water and went back to the dining room. It was, Kofi would think later, the most precise thing she could have said. Not "I heard what Vivienne said," not "thank you for noticing." Just a piece of information, given without context, that told him exactly where things stood. He thought about that for a long time. The thing about being underestimated is that it costs something. People don't talk about this enough. It's not just an inconvenience or an annoyance you shrug off at the end of the day. It's a kind of constant low-level drain, like leaving a light on in an empty room. You barely notice it individually, but over time the bill adds up. For Kofi, the accumulation looked like this. Vivienne asking him, very slowly and clearly, if he understood what dry clean only meant. Callum leaving notes on the kitchen counter that said things like, "Make sure to check the date on the milk this time." The way dinner guests addressed questions about the house to Vivienne, even when Kofi was standing right there, and the question was clearly in his domain. The way nobody introduced him, ever, in any room, as anything other than our household help. Not manager, not the title he'd been given in the contract, just help. He did his job. He did it exceptionally well, because that was the kind of person he was. The house ran smoothly. Meals were on time. Appointments were kept. The Hartwell household operated like a good watch, which meant, of course, that Vivienne and Callum never really had to think about it, which meant they never really had to think about him. Yuki noticed. He knew she noticed. There was a kind of silent acknowledgement between them that functioned like two people recognizing the same landmark in an unfamiliar city. You don't need to say anything. You just know you've both been here before. There were moments that lodged in Kofi's memory like splinters. One was the afternoon Callum's younger brother Fleischer came to visit with his girlfriend, and the four of them had lunch in the sunroom. Kofi served. At some point Fletcher said, gesturing at him without turning to look, "Do they all come through the same agency?" They landed in the room and stayed there. Callum said, "The agency on Bloor, yeah," and moved on. Kofi poured the water. His hand was steady. He was 34 years old with a first-class honors degree in business administration, a concentration in international finance, and 2 years of experience at a commodities trading firm in Accra. None of that was visible to anyone in the sunroom. Another was the Thursday evening that Vivienne hosted a dinner for the Meridian Capital delegation. the first time the full Shanghai team had visited Toronto. There were 9 people at the table, 5 of them from Meridian, including their lead negotiator, a woman named Dr. Chen Wei, who had a reputation in international finance circles for being extraordinarily meticulous. The dinner had been organized for weeks. Kofi had sourced the table linens, coordinated with the caterers, ensured the wine pairing was correct, confirmed dietary restrictions for all 9 guests, and arranged the table layout according to a seating plan that Vivienne had changed 4 times. At no point did Vivienne thank him for any of it. At some point during the appetizer course, while the table conversation was carefully navigating small talk in English, Dr. Chen Wei turned and said something in Mandarin to the colleague beside her. It was a private comment, the kind people make at large dinners when they want to say something they don't intend for the whole table. She said, "The house is beautifully managed. I wonder who does the actual work." Vivienne smiled serenely at Dr. Chen and did not respond, because Vivienne did not speak Mandarin. Kofi, who was refilling water glasses at the far end of the table, heard every word. He set the pitcher down carefully. He did not look at Dr. Chen. But something shifted in his chest, not embarrassment, not anger exactly, something quieter. Something that felt, for the first time in 2 years, a little bit like a plan. He had not intended to stay this long. He knew that. He'd told himself 6 months, then a year, and now it was creeping toward 22 months. And he had a good reason to stay, or rather, he had a reason he'd been honest enough to admit to himself on the long subway rides home on his days off. The Hartwell Group's Meridian deal was getting close. He had been watching it for months the way you watch a storm gathering, not with fear, but with a professional's attention. He knew the structure of the deal better than anyone at that dinner table, including Callum, because he had spent 2 years listening, and because he had spent his evenings in his apartment reading the financial press, following Meridian's public statements, tracking the way the Shanghai market had moved in the last quarter. Old habits from Accra. He kept notes in a notebook he kept in his bedside table. He didn't know what he was going to do with any of it yet. Then, 3 weeks before the deal was scheduled to close, Callum came home from a dinner meeting pale and visibly rattled. He sat in the kitchen and asked Kofi to make coffee, and then talked loudly on the phone for 90 minutes about a problem that had emerged in the due diligence process. A discrepancy in a subsidiary filing that Meridian's team had flagged, and which had caused Dr. Chen to formally request a clarification meeting before they would proceed. "She's not going to kill the deal over this," Callum said into the phone. "It's a filing error. It's fixable." The person on the other end said something Kofi couldn't hear. "Well, she can request all the clarification she wants," Callum said. "We'll put together a presentation." He hung up and sat there for a minute, then looked at Kofi like he'd just remembered he was in the room. "Kofi, Mr. Hartwell, do we have any of that scotch left?" "The Glenfarclas, yes. I'll get it." Kofi got the scotch and set it on the counter and then went back to tidying the kitchen. And he thought about the subsidiary filing discrepancy. And he thought about Dr. Chen Wei's reputation for meticulousness. And he thought about a very specific paragraph he had read in Meridian Capital's 2023 annual report about their criteria for subsidiary structure in North American partnerships. He thought about all of this very carefully. Then he went to his room and opened his notebook. 2 weeks later, the clarification meeting was scheduled for a Tuesday morning at the Hartwell Group offices in the financial district. Callum had put together a presentation with his team. Vivienne had decided, unusually, to attend. Bernard Lau had flown in from Vancouver. Kofi drove them. This was not normally part of his job, but their regular driver had called in sick that morning, and Vivienne had needed someone immediately, and Kofi had driven them in the Hartwell's car without comment, as he did most things. He parked in the underground garage, and they went upstairs without acknowledging him further. And he sat in the car for 11 minutes, and then he made a decision. He went upstairs too. The Hartwell Group offices were on the 23rd floor. The receptionist looked at him with the particular expression that receptionists have when someone walks in who doesn't fit the expected profile of the space. Kofi said, calmly, that he was here to deliver some documents for Mr. Hartwell, and could she let him know? She called Callum's assistant. There was a brief pause. The assistant came out and said, with practiced neutrality, "Can I ask what documents?" "I have a correction to the subsidiary filing analysis," Kofi said, "specifically regarding the gap in the cross-border holding structure that Meridian flagged. I believe there's a resolution that addresses Dr. Chen's criteria. It would take about 10 minutes. A longer pause. "I'll need to let Mr. Hartwell know." "I understand." He waited 12 minutes in a chair near the window with a view of the lake and the islands and the morning light coming off the water. He had his notebook. He had a printed version of what he'd put together. He was very calm. Then Callum came out. He stood in the doorway and looked at Kofi with an expression that was several things at once: surprise, confusion, something that was trying very hard not to be dismissive and not entirely succeeding. "Kofi, Mr. Hartwell, I apologize for coming unannounced. I have something that may be relevant to the Meridian meeting." Callum glanced back at the conference room. Through the glass wall, Kofi could see Vivian, Bernard, two lawyers, and at the far end of the table, Dr. Chen Wei and her team. "What is this about?" "The filing discrepancy. I think the gap they identified is actually a resolution structure issue, not a documentation error, and there's a precedent in cross-border partnership law that addresses it directly. The Meridian team would know it. They've used it in 2 previous North American deals." Callum stared at him. "You've been following the deal." "I've been following the financial press," Kofi said. "I've been doing that for a long time." Another silence. Long enough that Kofi could feel the weight of everything in it. Every month, every cleared plate, every slowly enunciated sentence. Every time someone in that house had spoken about him in a room he was also standing in. Callum said, "Show me." He showed him. Callum took the notebook, looked at the first 2 pages, looked up, looked back down. He said, "Where did you?" And then stopped, because the better version of himself, the version he didn't always let have the floor, understood that this was not the moment for that question. "Give me 5 minutes," Callum said, and took the documents back into the conference room. Kofi sat back down by the window. He could not hear what was happening in the conference room. He watched a plane begin its descent toward the lake, following the flight path, going somewhere. The assistant came back out at minute 4 and said, "Mr. Hartwell would like you to come in." He walked into the conference room and the room looked at him. Vivian's expression was the one he knew best, the careful blankness of someone in the process of revising a category. Bernard Lau looked curious. The Meridian team look the way professionals look when something unexpected has happened and they are deciding whether it is inconvenience or an opportunity. Dr. Chen Wei looked at him directly and said, in Mandarin, "You're the one who managed the dinner." And Kofi said, in Mandarin, "Yes, and I've read your firm's 2023 annual report. I believe the structure we're looking at may satisfy your criteria under Section 4 of the Cross-Border Partnership Framework." The room went very quiet. Dr. Chen set down her pen. Vivian, who had heard 2 sentences of a conversation she could not understand, was very still. Then Dr. Chen Wei said, in English for the room, "Mr. Asante," Kofi said. "Kofi Asante, Mr. Asante." She picked up the pages Callum had passed her. "Walk us through it." He walked them through it. It took 22 minutes. He stood at the end of the table, and he explained the holding structure, the cross-border precedent, the specific regulatory language that Meridian's team would have been looking for and had not found in the original filing because it had been framed incorrectly. Not falsely, just in a way that obscured what was actually there. He had restructured the argument. He had anticipated 3 of the 4 objections Dr. Chen raised. On the 4th one, he said, honestly, that it would require a secondary filing, and he could not speak to the timeline. Dr. Chen said, "Who prepared this?" "I did. Your background is in finance. International business, with a focus on cross-border transaction structures. I completed my degree at the University of Ghana and worked in commodities trading in Accra before coming to Canada." A brief pause. "Why are you managing someone's household?" It was a blunt question, and she had asked it in the flat, careful tone of someone who genuinely wanted to know. Kofi said, "I needed time to settle when I arrived. It was meant to be temporary." Dr. Chen looked at him for a moment. Then she said, to no one in particular, "I see," and she picked up her pen and made a note. The deal did not close that day. Deals like that never close in a single meeting, but Dr. Chen agreed to continue the conversation, which was what mattered, and 3 weeks later, the Hartwell Group and Meridian Capital signed a letter of intent worth $42 million, and Bernard Lau flew back to Vancouver. And Vivienne hosted a dinner to celebrate. Kofi was not at the dinner. He had given his notice the week before. He had done it quietly in writing, in the same manner he had done everything else in that house. He thanked Vivienne for the position. He gave 30 days. He had, by that point, already had 2 phone calls with a Bay Street firm that had gotten his name through a contact of Dr. Chen's, and a meeting scheduled for the following Monday. Vivienne accepted the notice with the expression of someone who wanted to say several things, and had decided not to. Callum, to his credit, came to find Kofi in the kitchen on the last evening. He stood in the doorway, the way he had stood in the doorway of the conference room, with the same expression, several things at once. "You didn't have to do this as quietly as you did," Callum said. It wasn't exactly an apology. Kofi didn't need it to be. "I know," Kofi said, "what you did in that meeting. I did what the situation needed." Callum was quiet for a moment. "Then I didn't know. I know you didn't." Another silence. The kind that contains a lot of unspoken arithmetic. What had been assumed, what had been missed, what had been said in kitchens and dining rooms and the backs of cars. Callum said, "I'm sorry for that." It was a small sentence for a large thing, but Kofi looked at him and thought of the man who had come home pale and rattled and asked for scotch and talked on the phone for 90 minutes without once looking at the person in the room. And also of the man who had taken a notebook into a conference room with a $42 million deal on the line, because something in him had decided it was worth trying. "Thank you," Kofi said. "I mean that." He finished washing the last of the glasses and set them on the rack to dry, and then he untied his apron, and he folded it neatly over the counter, and he walked out of the Hartwell kitchen for the last time. He thought about Yuki, too, in the weeks that followed. She had come to find him 2 days after the meeting, in the garden where he was doing the end-of-season work before the first frost. She sat on the stone steps and watched him work for a moment, and then she said, "I heard what happened. Word got around. Dr. Chen mentioned you by name in the follow-up correspondence." A pause. Vivienne saw the email. Kofi kept working. "I'm meeting with an employment lawyer on Friday," Yuki said. She said it the way she had said everything in that house. Plain, no editorializing. "I've been gathering documentation for about 8 months. I wanted you to know, in case I don't know, in case it matters to you." He looked at her. "It matters," he said. She nodded. Then she said, "I also want you to know. I noticed, for what it's worth, the whole time. I know you did. I should have said something sooner." She looked at the garden at the last of the autumn color. "I was waiting for the right moment." "So was I," Kofi said. She smiled briefly, and it was a real smile, not the careful, neutral expression she wore at dinner tables. It was the face of someone who had been holding something for a long time and had finally set it down. The Bay Street position started in January. His official title was Cross-Border Transaction Analyst. His office had a window that faced north, toward the city, and beyond it, the long, flat distance of the Canadian Shield. On his first morning, he arrived before anyone else, which was a habit he suspected he would not be able to break. And he stood at that window with his coffee, and looked out at Toronto in the gray January light. The streets already full of people going somewhere. The lake still visible at the edge of the skyline, everything moving, everything ordinary, everything completely indifferent to what any particular person had survived to get here. He thought about the folded piece of paper with a contact name he'd carried into this city. He thought about the apron he'd folded and set on the counter of a kitchen in Forest Hill. He thought about a conference room and a woman with a pen and a question that deserved an honest answer. Why are you managing someone's household? It was meant to be temporary. Most things that last years start out that way. But sooner or later, the time comes when temporary has gone on long enough, and you decide, not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly and with absolute certainty, that it's done. Kofi Asante set down his coffee and opened his notebook and started his first day.